Now I'll move to step 2 where we'll learn to determine the shape and position of a shadow. The shape of a shadow isn't random. It is influenced by the shape of the subject and the surface where the shadow is formed. Shadows are not formed on thin air. Well, technically they are, but they are not. They are always on some kind of surface. Shadows are always on a surface, and if the surface follows a certain kind of distortion or perspective, the shadow will follow too. This also answers the question I mentioned earlier about why the shadows here are not parallel even when the light is coming from the sun, because the position of the shadow is very dependent on the surface, and if the surface follows the perspective, the shadow will follow it too. If you're seeing the road from a top view, like I gave the example with the basketballs before, let's say these are the people from the top view, and if you are seeing everything from the top view, the shadows will be always parallel, like the shadows here are on front. And when I warp this into a perspective, as you can see, the shadows are no more parallel and they are going in a ray-like direction, because as I just said, if the surface follows the perspective, the shadow will follow too. You can see here some examples. As you can see, all the shadows in this image are parallel because it's the top view. You can see other examples right here. All the shadows are parallel. And if I remove the top view from the search, you can see the image here. When the road is in some kind of perspective, the shadows are in perspective too. You can see all the examples here. They follow a perspective. Now I'll show you an example of determining the shape and position of a shadow. Now what we have here is this background and a car right here. Since the position of the shadow is going to be determined by the perspective of the surface, I'll quickly draw the perspective in this background right here. It will be roughly from the center going something like this. The perspective graph will look somewhat like this. I'll turn its opacity down. So now that we know the perspective of the surface, we want to know the shape of the shadow and position of the shadow. So in order to do that, first of all, we need a light source. So let's assume here the light source is from the top and the light is coming from top to bottom. Light is coming from the top, which means all the side area will be illuminated and the area right down below the car will be darkened because the light will not reach there. So there is a way to determine the exactly precise area where the shadow will be formed. In order to do that, you need to create a cuboid around the car, touching all its corners. So like this corner, the tires, this and the front. So you need to create a cuboid touching all its corners. Starting with the front side here, it will go like this, touching the edges as will go above, then here, and then here. This is the front part of the cuboid, and the back part of the cuboid will also follow the perspective of the entire area surface because the car is in side view. So I'll just assume the back part will be somewhere around this. Taking the tire behind as a reference, they are somewhat visible. I'll draw a line there and make a second rectangle. Now I'll join them. Now if I erase some of the area here, here, and here, and here, and here, now it looks like the car is trapped in a cuboid. So the area which is touching the surface, which is the bottom part of the cuboid, will be the area where our shadow will be. So I'll quickly create a multiply layer and fill that area with a dark color. And now after covering the area, if I remove the blue cuboid, we'll get the shadow in perfect position and in perfect perspective. Only thing that is imperfect is the shape of the shadow. When you look a car from the top, it will look something like this. The mirror will be visible too, so the shape is not very refined. You need to refine it by taking your time. Since the light is coming from the top, some more tiny bumps on the car will block the light from going further here and there, like the mirror here. So you can refine the shadow further by finding the image of the car from the top view and taking reference from that. So here will be some shadow too, and here the corners of the car are rounded, so shadow will also be rounded. Same with the front part as well. So you may need to do some refinement, but that's how you determine the shape and position of a shadow. Now here this car was in perfect position, in perfect perspective, so it was easy. Now I'll take a bit more complicated one and show you example with that one. So now we have here is a completely different car. It is angled differently and it is shaped differently. Everything is different, and a bit more complicated. So how will determine the shape and position of the shadow in this case? First of all, I will bring back the perspective guides that I drew for the last scene, since it's the same background, so the same surface. And now for this one as well, let's assume the light is coming from the top, and in order to find the area where our shadow will be, I'll draw a cuboid around the car. So let's start by creating a cuboid around the car first. So going through all the edges like this. I'm assuming this may be the corner of the front. It's very rounded, so it's difficult to determine here, but I will assume this is. It seems the most obvious. It goes like this. From the bottom, it will go touching the tires like this. More back, front part. Front part will be like this, and the behind touching this part like this. Let's create the bottom part as well. Here, something like this. This is the corner, so it will pass through here, here, here. The corner behind might be here and here, and let's connect this here. This one is a bit difficult and complicated cuboid, so I'll just erase these parts here. Now the car is trapped in a cuboid, and we have the area where our shadow will be, which will be the bottom part of the cuboid, which is touching the surface, as you can see. So I will now create a multiply layer again and fill that area with a dark color. After filling the area, I'll remove the cuboid, and you can see I can also remove the perspective guidelines, and you can see the area. This is the area where our shadow will be, and in order to refine the shape of the shadow, you need to see the view of the car from the top, since the light is coming from the top, and it will be something similar to this. And we can define the shapes going like this, back part like this, front part more curved like this, and the tire is slightly bended here, so here will be a slight bump, and that will be pretty much the shadow for the car here. I'll make the front corners a little bit more rounded, and that will be almost the shadow for the car here if the light is coming from the top direction. So this is a scenario where the light is coming from the top direction. What if the light is coming from a different direction? How will that influence the shadow and position according to the perspective? So I'll show you now real quick. Let's say if the light is coming from behind here and it is going in our direction, let's make another light source. Light is coming from the right direction here, and make another source. Light is coming from the left direction. So I will hide the right and left first and show you if the light is coming from behind, how that will affect shadow. So I'll grab the shadow. Now I'll select the shadow using the perspective warp and warp it forward. Since the light is coming from behind, the shadow will be going forward. So I will warp it. Also, I will warp it according to the perspective here. I am changing the perspective of the shadow here, and didn't change last time even when the surface was in perspective, because the light was coming from the top direction and the perspective of that was already default when I made the cube. But now this time the light is coming from behind, so it will follow the perspective. So carefully following the perspective guidelines, I will warp the shadow, and roughly this is how the shadow will be if the light is coming from behind. I'll show you a quick before and after. This was the shadow when the light was from the top, and this was the shadow when the light is from the behind. This may not seem like a huge difference, but it makes much of a difference in terms of realism. So now what if the light is coming from left and right direction? So we'll use the perspective warp tool again and select the shadow rectangularly. Make sure you are touching all the edges of the shadow. Then I'll go to warp. Let's assume the light is coming from the right direction in this time, and since the light is coming from the right direction, the shadow will be warped toward the left direction. Following the perspective guide, this is how the shadow will be. The right side will remain as it is, and the left side only will be warped, and this is how the shadow will look if the light is coming from the right side. And if the light is coming from the left side, same thing. We select the shadow using perspective warp, then warp it towards the right side. The distance, how long you Warp, it depends on the intensity of the light, and you see other objects in the background, how long their shadow is. You'll basically get the gist of it, how long the shadow will be, by seeing the light. So the shadow will be something like this if the light is coming from the left direction on the right side. This may not look much, but these minor changes makes a lot of difference in terms of realism. This is when the light is coming from the left side, this is when the light is coming from the top side, and this is when the light is coming from behind. Now let's take another simple example here. Here we have a simple table background, and now I'll take again the basketball. I'll position it right around here. Now you can clearly see the light is coming from this direction, so the shadow will be obviously in this direction. So here's how I'll show you how to use the perspective to determine the shape and position of the shadow. So first I'll map out the perspective very quickly. So this is how roughly the perspective is on the table. Thanks to the clear direction of light, we already know the direction of the shadow. The direction of the shadow will be here. Now you'll use this perspective as our advantage to get the perfect position of the shadow. As for the car, we did a cuboid, but here we have a ball which is already a sphere. It is already a 3D object, and you can make a cube around it as well if you want to, because this ball is already a sphere and its silhouette from pretty much every side will look the same, sphere, circular. So what you can do is select it, or you can duplicate it and make it black and turn it multiply, or just select it and go to an empty layer and paint it in a darker color. Change the blade mode to multiply. Now all we have to do is warp it on the graph of the table. So I'll go to perspective warp and select the ball touching all its corners, and now I'll warp this on the table. Carefully following the graph we made on the table. Now whether it will be long or short will depend on the environment and the light source. In the light source you can see the shadows for everything. The curtains, the table are very long, so we'll just make it longer. Once you're done, move the shadow layer behind the bulb and remove the perspective graph here, and then you can mask it and play around with its opacity. Now you have found a perfect position for the shadow of the ball, direction, shape, and everything. Again, one thing to keep in mind, that shadows are not in thin air, they are always on a surface. Let's say even if I take this basketball here and lift it off the table, the shadow will not fly off the table here. It will not be in the midair. It will still be on the table. Also, the distance between the subject and the shadow can determine how far or close it is to the surface. If the subject is close to the surface, like here, it should be touching the shadow. But if the surface is high up, shadows will be also far. You can use this technique to create the illusion that the ball is flying in the air, right, like right here. But the further away the ball will go, the further away the shadow will also go, and its opacity will also decrease. The more further the ball will go, the more further the shadow will also go, and its opacity will become less and less as further the ball goes. So now you know the shadows are not in thin air, they are always on the surface and they follow the surface. If the surface is in perspective, it will follow the perspective. If the surface is bumpy, the shadow will also be bumpy. Like you can see here, the shadow is not straight, it is bumpy because the surface is bumpy. Here's another example of the dirt bike here. You can see the surface is bumpy, so the shadow is bumpy as well. Same goes for pretty much every surface. For example, let's say here we have a stair. Here the shadow will follow the contours of the stair. It will not be just straight. If the surface is bending, the shadow will bend. If the surface is rough, the shadow will be rough. If the surface is smooth, the shadow will be smooth. So now we have learned how to determine the direction, shape, and position of the shadow.